My name is Florence Carter. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in roles that people politely describe as support, administrative coordination, internal operations, documentation management, titles that sound modest enough that most people stop listening halfway through them. If you asked my former coworkers how they saw me, the answer would probably be simple: reliable, quiet, organized. The person who could always find a missing file or fix a scheduling disaster. And if we're being honest, the person no one thought very much about. That's not said with bitterness. It's just the truth of how offices work sometimes. There are people who present ideas in conference rooms, and there are people who quietly make sure the conference room actually functions. For years, I was firmly in the second category. I didn't complain about it. In fact, for a long time, I believed there was a certain dignity in doing work that didn't require attention. I liked systems. I liked the details. I liked understanding how things actually moved beneath the surface of an organization. But invisibility has a strange side effect. When people assume you're not important, they stop being careful around you. They talk freely. They overlook things. They assume you're not paying attention. And over time, you begin to see patterns that others miss. This story isn't about revenge. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting in boardrooms, no moment where someone storms out of a building carrying a cardboard box. What happened instead was quieter than that. It began on a Monday morning when a new employee joined our department and sat at the desk beside mine. His name was Daniel, and like most new hires, he spent the first few days asking questions, trying to learn how things worked. Nothing about that moment seemed unusual. But by Friday of that same week, something happened that no one in the office could fully explain. The new employee who had sat next to me on Monday became my manager on Friday, and the strange part wasn't just how fast it happened. The strange part was that no one in the office seemed to know how that promotion happened so quickly. Except me. Because sometimes when you spend years quietly observing a system, you begin to understand exactly where its pressure points are. And when the moment finally comes, you realize something important. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. But before I explain how any of that unfolded, I should probably start with something simpler. Who I was to them before any of this began. So let me ask you something before we continue. Have you ever worked in a place where people didn't really see you, even though you were the one holding everything together? If you had walked into our office on any random Tuesday morning 2 years ago, you probably would not have noticed me. Not in the way people notice others. Our floor sat on the 12th level of a glass building overlooking Elliott Bay. It was the kind of modern workspace that companies like to show in recruiting brochures. Open desks, clean lighting. A long shared table where people gathered with laptops and half-finished coffee. Most of the attention in that space naturally drifted toward the consultants. They were the visible engine of the company. The ones who met with clients, led presentations, and talked about strategy in confident voices. Their calendars were full of meetings with names that sounded important. Market alignment, executive review, transformation planning. My desk was along the interior row. Not hidden exactly, just not central. From there, I managed calendars, travel bookings, document archives, contract templates, internal reports, and the thousand small logistical threads that kept the consulting teams from collapsing under their own schedules. Most people described my role the same way. Florence keeps everything organized. It was said kindly, sometimes even appreciatively. But appreciation and visibility are not the same thing. Visibility means people understand what you actually do. Appreciation often just means they're glad they don't have to think about it. Over time, you start to notice how certain patterns form. When a meeting started late, someone would say, "Florence, can you pull up the file from last quarter?" When a client asked for a document that no one could find, someone would turn around in their chair and call, "Florence, Do you know where the contract archive is? When an executive needed a presentation assembled overnight, the request would arrive in my inbox at 7:43 p.m. Florence, quick favor. The phrase quick favor is one of the quiet jokes of office life. It almost never means quick, but I rarely pushed back. Not because I lacked confidence, and not because I felt obligated. I simply understood something that many people in offices don't fully grasp. Information moves through the quietest channels. While others talked in meetings, I was the one organizing the notes. While teams debated strategy, I was the one assembling the reports that revealed what had actually happened. Over time, that position gave me something subtle but powerful. Perspective. I knew which departments consistently missed deadlines, which executives quietly corrected other people's mistakes, which clients were genuinely satisfied, and which ones were only pretending during presentations. Most people didn't realize how much of a company's real story lives in small operational details. But those details passed through my hands every single day. Still, none of that changed how people perceived me. To them, I was a dependable background structure, a reliable system, not a strategic voice, and certainly not someone who might influence outcomes. There were small signs of that perception everywhere. In meetings, I was often asked to sit in and take notes, even when I had helped assemble the very data the meeting was based on. In email threads, I was frequently copied after decisions had already been made. Sometimes, someone would even explain something to me that I had personally documented the week before. I didn't correct them. Correcting people changes how they feel about you. Observing them reveals who they really are. So I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I did my work carefully. And every evening before leaving the office, I wrote a few lines in the navy leather notebook I kept in my bag. Dates, small observations, processes that didn't quite make sense. Nothing dramatic, just patterns. At the time, I didn't know exactly why I was recording those things. Maybe it was simply a habit. Maybe it was instinct. But looking back now, I think part of me already understood something the rest of the office didn't. Invisibility gives you access to the entire room, and the longer people assume you're just part of the furniture, the more freely they reveal themselves. That was who I was to them. Quiet, reliable, invisible. Which is why, when the new employee sat down beside my desk on that Monday morning, no one thought twice about it. No one imagined that by the end of that same week, something inside the structure of our office would quietly shift. And no one imagined that the person who had been watching everything for years might finally decide to move. The new employee arrived on a Monday morning that felt ordinary in every possible way. Rain against the windows, the quiet hum of laptops waking up. Someone in the corner is trying unsuccessfully to fix the office espresso machine. His name was Daniel Mercer. He looked to be in his early 30s, confident posture, neatly pressed shirt, the kind of calm energy that suggested he had done this before. Not necessarily this job, but the process of entering a new environment and quickly learning its rhythms. Human resources gave him the usual tour: restrooms, break area, printer stations. Eventually, they guided him to the empty desk beside mine. "Florence," the HR coordinator said with a friendly smile. "This is Daniel. He'll be joining the consulting team." Daniel shook my hand politely. "Nice to meet you." His tone was respectful, though slightly distracted, the way people often are on their first day when everything around them still feels unfamiliar. "You too," I said. For the first hour, things unfolded exactly as they usually do when someone new arrives. Logins were created, software access was granted. A small pile of onboarding documents appeared in his inbox. At one point, he leaned slightly toward my desk. "Sorry," he said. "Do you know where people usually store project archives?" I turned my chair and pointed toward the internal database system on his screen. "Most teams use the shared repository," I explained. but older projects are stored in the internal archive. If you search by client code, you'll usually find what you need. He nodded. Got it. Thanks. It was a small exchange, the kind that happens dozens of times whenever someone joins a new office. But later that afternoon, something else happened. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no obvious tension. Just a small moment. The consulting team gathered for their weekly planning meeting in the glass conference room near the center of the floor. As usual, I had helped prepare the background documents earlier that morning. Budget updates, client timelines, project status summaries. One of the senior consultants, Ethan, stood near the screen reviewing the slides. Halfway through the meeting, Daniel raised a question. Where did these project performance numbers come from? Ethan glanced briefly at the slide. Operations compiled them, he said casually. Daniel looked thoughtful. Do we know how accurate they are? There was nothing aggressive in the question. It sounded almost academic. But something about the wording hung in the room. Ethan shrugged lightly. They're probably fine. Florence pulls most of that stuff together. A few people nodded without much thought. Then Daniel turned his chair slightly toward the back of the room where I sat, taking notes. Oh, he said, in a tone that sounded politely curious. So, you're the one who organizes all this? I nodded. Yes. He studied the slide again for a moment. Interesting, he said. I guess I'll double-check the numbers later, just to be safe. The meeting moved on immediately after that. No one reacted, no one commented. And to anyone else in the room, the moment probably seemed insignificant. But small moments have weight when you're used to watching them closely. Because the implication wasn't really about the numbers. It was about an assumption. The assumption that data assembled by someone in my position might require verification. Not because of evidence, simply because of where it came from. I didn't say anything. There was no reason to. The numbers were correct. I knew that. Anyone who examined the source files would eventually confirm it. Still, when the meeting ended and people began filing out of the conference room, I noticed Daniel glance once more at the presentation screen before leaving. Thoughtful, analytical, not hostile, just cautious. And as I returned to my desk, I wrote a short line in my navy leather notebook. Monday. New hire questioned operations data in the first meeting. It wasn't anger that made me write it down. It was curiosity. Because sometimes the first small cut in a story isn't about pain. Sometimes it's simply the first signal that someone new has entered the system. And they're already trying to understand where the pressure points might be. After that first meeting, the office settled quickly back into its usual rhythm. Deadlines returned. Calendars are filled again. The quiet machinery of the week resumed. Daniel spent most of the next 2 days doing what every new consultant does, reviewing past projects, studying client files, and asking careful questions. At first, our interactions remained perfectly professional. He would occasionally lean over and ask where a document was stored or how a particular report was structured. I would show him the system, explain the naming conventions, and point him toward the right folders. Nothing about those moments felt uncomfortable. If anything, Daniel seemed more curious than most new hires. He asked detailed questions about processes that others usually ignored. But curiosity, in certain environments, has a subtle side effect. It sometimes turns into a quiet hierarchy. The second moment came on Wednesday afternoon. A few members of the consulting team were discussing a client report near my desk. They had printed several draft pages and spread them across the shared table. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly. These projections seem conservative, he said. Ethan shrugged. That's the template we've always used. Daniel tapped one of the numbers with his finger. Who set the baseline assumptions? Ethan answered without looking up from his laptop. Florence usually compiles the background data. Daniel nodded slightly. Then he said something that, again, sounded reasonable on the surface. Maybe we should rebuild the model from scratch. There was no accusation in his voice, just calm analysis. But the phrasing carried an implication. Rebuild. As if the structure already in place might not be trustworthy. One of the other consultants laughed lightly. "Don't worry about it," she said. "Florence's spreadsheets are basically the backbone of this place." She meant it as praise. But Daniel responded with a small smile. "I'm sure they are," he said. "I just like understanding how things work." That was the second moment I wrote down in my notebook, not because I felt insulted, but because I recognized a pattern beginning to form. Daniel wasn't dismissive in the obvious way some people are. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice or act superior. Instead, his approach was quieter. He questioned structures. He re-examined processes. And each time the conversation seemed to place my work slightly further into the background, as something useful but provisional. Something to be checked, verified, possibly replaced. To most people in the office, this kind of interaction barely registered. Consultants question systems all the time. It's practically part of their job description. But from my seat beside him, I could see something others couldn't yet. Daniel wasn't simply learning how the company worked. He was mapping it. Mapping who produced information, who controlled decisions, who actually held influence, and who didn't. Late Wednesday evening, most of the team had already left. The office lights dimmed automatically along half the floor, leaving only a few desks illuminated. Daniel was still working. He had several spreadsheets open, cross-referencing project performance numbers. At one point, he leaned slightly toward me. "Florence," he said. "Yes? Do you always maintain the master data files for these reports?" "Yes." He studied the screen for a moment. That's a lot of responsibility for one person. His tone sounded almost impressed, but then he added quietly, "I'm surprised management hasn't centralized that process." I closed the document I was reviewing and looked back at my own screen. "They have," I said calmly. He glanced over. "Where?" "In my desk." For the first time since he arrived, Daniel paused. Not long, just a second longer than usual. Then he nodded slowly and returned to his spreadsheet. The conversation ended there. But that evening, before leaving the office, I opened my Navy notebook again. Wednesday. Daniel analyzing reporting structures. And underneath that line, I added something else. Observation. Questioning processes are becoming routine. Because that's how normalization works in professional environments. The first moment feels unusual. The second moment feels analytical. And by the third or fourth time, everyone stops noticing it altogether. Except for the person quietly watching the pattern form. By Thursday morning, Daniel had been in the office for 4 days. That's not a long time in the life of a company. Most new employees spend weeks simply learning where things are and who handles what. But some people observe faster than others. And Daniel was clearly one of those people. He had already figured out something that took many new hires much longer to notice. Every office has invisible roles. Not the ones listed in job descriptions. The ones that develop quietly over time. There are people whose opinions shape decisions. The people who move quickly between meetings and client calls. The people whose ideas are heard immediately when they speak. And then there are the people who keep everything functioning behind the scenes. The reliable ones. The steady ones. The ones everyone trusts to solve problems, but rarely asks what they think about them. I had occupied that role for years. Not officially. Not deliberately. It simply happened gradually. Someone asks you to help with a report. Then another team begins sending their data to you. Eventually, you become the person who knows where everything is. And once that perception settles into place, it becomes remarkably stable. People stop questioning it. More importantly, they stop imagining you in any other position. By Thursday afternoon, I could see that Daniel had already placed me firmly inside that category. Reliable infrastructure. Someone who maintained systems, not someone who influenced them. That afternoon, the consulting team gathered again around the long table near the windows. They were reviewing preparation materials for a client presentation scheduled the following week. Daniel had already been assigned to assist with the project, which was unusual. Most new hires don't join client-facing work quite that quickly, but management clearly saw potential in him. As the conversation moved between slides, Ethan looked up. "Florence," he said casually, "could you pull the historical revenue charts for the Larson account?" "Oh, of course." I opened the archive and projected the files onto the screen. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, studying the numbers. "Do we have the underlying model for this?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "It's included in the appendix." He nodded slowly. "Good." Then he said something that seemed harmless enough. "Would you mind sending me the full dataset later?" "Not at all." "Perfect," he said. "I'd like to restructure the analysis before the client meeting." The others around the table didn't react. In fact, a few of them seemed relieved that someone was taking initiative. But the wording stayed with me. Restructure the analysis. Do not update it. Do not refine it. Restructure it. Again, it wasn't hostile. Daniel never spoke with arrogance or dismissiveness, but his language carried an assumption that had already begun to solidify. The assumption that my role was to supply information, and his role was to interpret it. It was a common division in consulting environments. Data providers, decision makers, and once that line forms, it tends to reinforce itself. Later that evening, after most of the office had gone home, I sat quietly at my desk reviewing a set of archived reports. Daniel passed by on his way to the elevator. He paused briefly. "You're still here?" he asked. "I usually am." He glanced at the stack of documents beside my keyboard. "You must know more about this company than anyone else here." I gave a small smile. "Maybe." He considered that for a moment. Then he said something interesting. "That kind of knowledge is powerful," he said. But the way he said it suggested something else. Not powerful in the sense of influence. Powerful in the sense of usefulness. A resource. A system. Something stable that others could build on. After he left, I opened my Navy notebook again. Thursday. Daniel requested full datasets for restructuring. And below that, I wrote a second line. Role assignment complete. Because by the end of that fourth day, something subtle had settled into place. Daniel had already decided who I was in the ecosystem of the office. Reliable, capable, helpful, and invisible. The kind of person who keeps everything running smoothly, but never changes the direction the machine is moving. What he didn't know, what no one in that office had ever fully realized, was that the longer someone occupies that role, the more clearly they begin to see how the machine actually works. And sometimes, seeing the system clearly is the first step toward changing it. Thursday evening was quiet. Most of the consultants had already left by 6. The energy of the office changed after that hour. Conversations disappeared. Lights dimmed in long rows across the ceiling, and the entire floor began to feel less like a workplace and more like a library. I often stayed late. Not because anyone asked me to, but because the end of the day was the only time the system slowed down enough for me to review things carefully. That evening, I was organizing archived project folders for the Larson account, the same one Daniel had asked about earlier that afternoon. It was routine work. I had done it dozens of times before. But while reviewing the data models, I noticed something unusual. One of the archived financial reports had been modified earlier that day. That in itself wasn't strange. Reports were updated constantly. What caught my attention was the user log attached to the file. Daniel Mercer. Timestamp: 3:14 p.m. I opened the revision history. Daniel had not only reviewed the dataset, I had expected that, He had also downloaded a full copy of the raw financial model and created a separate working version. Again, not inherently problematic, except for one small detail. He had renamed the new file. Not analysis update, not draft revision. He had titled it Revenue Optimization Framework, Draft. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The name itself wasn't the issue. The implication was, because optimization framework was a language typically used for internal consulting proposals, the kind of models senior consultants sometimes develop when pitching new services to clients. Daniel had been in the company for 4 days. Most new hires spent their first month simply learning internal systems. Yet here he was, already building what looked like a new analytical model using internal financial data. I didn't feel threatened by that. If anything, I felt curious. Curiosity had always been my strongest instinct. So I did what I always did when something caught my attention. I followed the pattern. The file path showed that Daniel had also accessed several additional archives that afternoon. Client revenue projections, internal benchmarking reports, historical performance summaries, all the documents I had organized over the past 2 years. As I reviewed the access logs, something slowly became clear. Daniel wasn't randomly exploring data. He was assembling a picture, a very specific picture. He was studying how the consulting teams justified strategic recommendations to clients and where the supporting data actually came from. And more importantly, he was reconstructing the structure behind it. At that moment, something subtle shifted in my thinking. Until then, Daniel had simply been a new employee asking analytical questions. But now I have realized something different. He wasn't just learning the system, he was trying to improve it, or possibly position himself within it. Neither of those motivations was inherently wrong. In fact, ambition often looks exactly like that during the early days of a career. But sitting there in the quiet office, looking at the archive logs, I felt a small internal adjustment. Not concerned, not suspicion, just clarity. Because for the first time that week, I realized something important. Daniel had been observing the structure of the company, but he had also been unknowingly revealing something about himself. His speed, his ambition, his willingness to move before others expected him to. Those qualities can take someone very far in an organization, but they also create pressure points. And I had spent years quietly studying pressure points. I closed the revision history and returned to organizing the archive folders. A few minutes later, I opened my navy leather notebook and wrote one short entry. Thursday evening, Daniel is building an independent analytical framework. Then, after a moment, I added a second line. Observation. He moves quickly. That night when I left the office, the rain had stopped, and the streets outside were almost empty. I walked past the glass windows of the building and looked briefly back at the 12th floor. For years, I had simply maintained the systems inside that office. But that evening, something inside my perspective had changed. Not dramatically, just quietly. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't only maintaining the structure. I was beginning to think about how it might move. Friday morning began like any other. Coffee cups appeared across desks. The low murmur of early conversations drifted through the office. Someone had already started a video call in one of the conference rooms, their voice echoing faintly through the glass walls. If anything, the atmosphere felt slightly lighter than usual. Fridays often carried that effect. But from the moment I sat down at my desk, I noticed something small. Daniel had arrived earlier than usual. His chair was already pulled forward, laptop open, several spreadsheets visible across his screen. The faint glow of the monitors reflected in the glass wall beside him. He didn't seem hurried, just focused. I set my bag down and opened my calendar for the day. A few scheduling adjustments, 2 internal meetings, and a set of reports that needed to be finalized before the weekend. Routine work. After a few minutes, Daniel turned slightly toward me. "Morning, Florence." "Good morning." He hesitated for a moment. "Did you happen to see the model I sent Ethan last night?" I hadn't, but I suspected what he meant. "The optimization framework?" I asked. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You saw the file name?" "I manage the archive logs," I said calmly. A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Right. Of course you do." He turned his laptop slightly so I could see the screen. Rows of projections filled the spreadsheet. Revenue models, cost adjustments, comparative scenarios. "You'll probably notice I used the historical data sets you compiled," he said. I did. "What do you think?" It was the first time he had asked my opinion directly. Not where a file was, not how a system worked, what I thought. I studied the screen for a moment. The model was well built. Not perfect. There were a few assumptions that could be refined, but the structure itself was thoughtful. "You move quickly," I said. He leaned back slightly in his chair. That's usually the point. There was no arrogance in the reply, just quiet confidence. "Are you planning to show this to management?" I asked. "Already did," he said. That answer landed softly in the space between us. Not confrontational, not defensive, just factual. A few seconds passed before he added something else. "I figured if the firm already has the data infrastructure, it might as well be used more strategically." Strategically. It was interesting how often that word appeared in consulting environments. I nodded once. "Ambitious for your first week." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Opportunities appear early sometimes." Then he returned his attention to the spreadsheet. The conversation ended there. But in that moment, I understood something clearly. Daniel believed he was moving quietly, building something useful, presenting value to management, positioning himself as someone capable of improving the system. And in many ways, he was right. But what he didn't realize was that while he had been studying the system had also been quietly studying him. I didn't mention the revision logs. I didn't question the timing of his presentation to management. I didn't point out that most internal frameworks went through several weeks of review before reaching senior leadership. I simply opened my own reports and continued working. Silence, in that moment, wasn't hesitation. It was a choice. Because when you've spent years observing how organizations move, you learn something important. Information reveals itself fastest when people believe no one is challenging them. So I watched. I listened. And I waited. By midday, something unusual began to happen across the office. Several senior managers had started arriving on our floor, one by one, quietly. No announcements, no scheduled meetings are visible on the shared calendar. Just subtle movement. Doors are closing in conference rooms. Low conversations behind glass walls. Daniel didn't seem to notice. He was still refining his model. But from my desk, with a view of the hallway and access to the internal scheduling system, I could see the pattern forming. And by early afternoon, it became clear that something inside the structure of the company was beginning to shift. When people talk about preparation, they often imagine something dramatic. Late nights, urgent decisions, a sudden realization that changes everything. In reality, preparation usually looks much quieter than that. It looks like years of small observations that no one else bothers to collect. By Friday afternoon, while the consulting team continued their normal work, a different layer of activity had begun unfolding in the office. Senior managers had appeared without much explanation. 2 directors were meeting behind the glass wall of conference room B. The head of operations had arrived from the 10th floor. Even the managing partner, someone who rarely visited our department in person, had briefly walked through earlier that morning. To most people, these movements meant nothing. Offices are full of meetings, but I had spent years organizing executive calendars, preparing internal reports, and managing the document archives that supported strategic discussions. I knew how the rhythm of leadership worked, and this rhythm was unusual. Daniel, meanwhile, remained focused on his model. Every so often, he adjusted a formula, ran another projection, or sent an updated version of the framework to someone in management. He was moving quickly, exactly as I had noted the night before. What he didn't realize was that speed creates visibility, and visibility, in organizations, always attracts attention. While Daniel worked beside me, I opened the internal scheduling system, not to investigate him, just to understand the pattern forming around the floor. Several new calendar entries had appeared within the past 2 hours. Executive review session, internal model assessment, strategy alignment discussion. None of those meetings were listed on the public department schedule, but I recognized the formatting of the invitations. They had been created directly by the managing partner's assistant, which meant something important. Leadership had noticed Daniel's framework, and they were evaluating it. I didn't feel surprised by that. In fact, it made perfect sense. Ambitious analytical models are exactly the kind of thing senior partners like to examine. They signal initiative, strategic thinking, and potential leadership capacity. Still, something else about the situation caught my attention. Every one of those executive meetings included the same attachments: Daniel's framework and the historical datasets, the same datasets I had compiled over the past 2 years. That fact didn't bother me. Data infrastructure rarely receives credit in consulting environments. The person who builds the model is usually the one recognized. But sitting there at my desk, quietly watching the system respond to Daniel's work, I began to notice a deeper pattern. For years, I had maintained the operational backbone of the company: financial reports, performance archives, client outcome tracking. All of it was organized, verified, and maintained carefully in systems that only a handful of people fully understood. Most employees treated those archives like a filing cabinet. Daniel was one of the first people who had looked at them like a strategic resource, and now leadership was doing the same. That realization didn't upset me. If anything, it confirmed something I had quietly suspected for a long time. Information becomes powerful only when someone recognizes its potential. Around mid-afternoon, Daniel stood up from his desk. "Heading to grab coffee," he said. "Would you like one?" I shook my head. "I'm good, thank you." He nodded and walked toward the elevator. The moment he left, I turned back to my computer and opened the archive dashboard. Not Daniel's files, the infrastructure behind them. Access permissions, data sources, reporting pipelines, systems that most employees never looked at closely. For years, I had been responsible for maintaining them, but as I reviewed the structure that afternoon, I noticed something interesting. The datasets Daniel had used for his framework were only one part of a much larger reporting system. There were additional archives, executive performance reviews, long-term client profitability models, strategic forecasting reports, information layers that are rarely left at the internal leadership level. Most employees didn't even know those systems existed. But as the administrative coordinator responsible for organizing company documentation, I had access, not to change them, not to control them, simply to maintain them. And maintenance requires visibility. That afternoon, I sat quietly, reviewing those structures with a perspective I had never applied before, not as a caretaker of the system, but as someone observing how the system could move. By the time Daniel returned with his coffee 20 minutes later, I had already closed the archive dashboard. My screen showed nothing unusual, just the routine scheduling report I had been updating earlier. "Looks like a busy afternoon," he said as he sat back down. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Fridays sometimes are." He didn't notice anything unusual. No one did. Because the truth is, preparation rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, in the background, in the same place where I had spent years working without anyone paying much attention. And while the rest of the office continued moving through its normal routines, something important was happening beneath the surface. Leadership was reviewing Daniel's work. Daniel believed he was presenting a new framework, and I had just begun to understand exactly where that framework fit inside the larger structure of the company. What they never noticed was simple. While everyone else focused on the new model, I was the only person in the room who understood the entire system it depended on. Daniel spent the rest of Friday afternoon refining his model. From where I sat, I could see the structure evolving across his screen. Columns expanded, projections adjusted, formulas rewritten. Every so often, he would pause, studying the results as if testing how the numbers behaved under different conditions. It was good work, thoughtful work, and I suspected the senior partners were noticing the same thing in their closed meetings down the hallway. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the model he had built depended on something far larger than the spreadsheets in front of him. It depended on the internal architecture of the company's data, and that architecture was something very few people fully understood. Not because it was secret, simply because most people never needed to think about it. Consultants typically interact with clean datasets, numbers that appear neatly arranged inside presentations or analytical templates. They focus on interpretation, recommendations, and strategy. But before data becomes clean, someone has to assemble it, verify it, maintain it. Over the years, that responsibility had quietly become mine. Every quarter, I updated the reporting structures that fed into internal dashboards. Every year, I archived historical performance models that executives used when evaluating long-term client relationships. Thousands of files, hundreds of reporting pipelines, and one central documentation system that tracked how all of it connected together. That system existed mainly so that if someone asked, "Where did this number come from?" there would always be an answer. Most employees never looked at it, but that Friday afternoon, while the consulting team focused on their own work, I opened it again. Not out of suspicion, out of curiosity. The documentation tree expanded across my screen, folders branching into layers of datasets and report structures, client profitability analyses, operational forecasting models, executive planning frameworks. Daniel's model had been drawn from only a small portion of that system, which made sense. He had discovered the most accessible layer, the one designed for internal reporting. But beneath it were deeper datasets that only leadership typically reviewed. Historical performance comparisons, risk modeling archives, strategic projections were prepared during previous restructuring cycles. As I reviewed those files, something became clear. Daniel's framework was clever, but it wasn't entirely new. Years earlier, a similar concept had been explored during an internal strategy review. At the time, leadership had experimented with building a predictive model that optimized revenue projections across multiple client sectors. The idea had been promising, but the infrastructure hadn't been ready yet. The available datasets were incomplete, and the company's reporting systems were still evolving. So the project had quietly been archived. Not abandoned, just waiting. Now, Daniel had independently built something remarkably similar, not identical, but close enough that the resemblance was impossible to ignore. I leaned back slightly in my chair. This wasn't a problem. In fact, it might be exactly why management had called those sudden meetings earlier in the day. They were probably comparing Daniel's framework with the earlier internal concept, seeing whether the timing was finally right. For a few minutes, I simply studied the archive notes attached to the older project. Then something else caught my attention. At the bottom of the documentation page was a small administrative comment, a reminder left by a former director who had since retired. It read, "If this framework is ever revived, operational data maintenance must remain centralized. Fragmentation would create reporting inconsistencies. Oski kin and Dane, centralized." That word stayed with me, because at that moment, I realized something Daniel probably hadn't considered. His model worked because the data feeding it was stable, verified, maintained through a single operational pipeline. If that structure changed, even slightly, the reliability of the entire framework would change with it, and I was the person responsible for maintaining that structure. I closed the archive system slowly, not because I had discovered some kind of hidden advantage, but because I had discovered clarity. Daniel had built a promising model. Leadership was evaluating it, and beneath all of it sat a quiet operational foundation that almost no one in the consulting team ever thought about. Except me. I opened my navy leather notebook and wrote a new entry. Friday. Daniel's framework mirrors the archived strategy concept. Then I added one final line beneath it. Key dependency. Centralized data infrastructure. For a moment, I simply looked at those words, not with excitement, not with anxiety, just understanding. Because leverage rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time, it appears as a simple realization, a moment where you suddenly see how different pieces of a system connect. And once you see that connection clearly, you can never unsee it. Across the desk, Daniel was still adjusting his formulas, completely absorbed in the elegance of the model he had built. He looked satisfied, confident, as if he had just solved a complicated puzzle. And in many ways, he had. What he didn't realize was that the puzzle extended far beyond the spreadsheet in front of him. And that realization, quiet and private, was the moment when everything in the story became perfectly clear to me. By late Friday afternoon, the office had grown quieter. Several consultants had already left for the weekend, and the hallway outside our department carried that familiar end-of-week stillness. Chairs pushed in, computer screens dimming one by one. Daniel was still working beside me. Every few minutes, he would run another scenario in the model, watching how the numbers shifted when different assumptions were applied. From the outside, it looked like a simple moment of professional focus. But from my perspective, something else had already happened. The picture was complete. Daniel had created a compelling framework. Leadership had noticed it almost immediately. And the entire structure of that framework rested on the operational data system I had spent years maintaining. None of this was dramatic. No one was competing. No one was trying to undermine anyone else. But the situation had quietly produced several possible paths. I could continue doing what I had always done. Maintain the infrastructure. Organize the datasets. Let others present the strategy built on top of it. That had been the pattern for years. There was nothing wrong with it, but there was another option now. For the first time, the system I maintained had become central to a strategic discussion happening at the highest level of the firm. Leadership was actively reviewing a framework that depended entirely on the stability of that infrastructure. And I was the person who understood that infrastructure better than anyone in the building. Not because I had power, simply because I had been the one quietly maintaining it all along. So the decision in front of me wasn't emotional. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply about clarity. Would I remain the invisible caretaker of the system? Or would I step forward, calmly, professionally, and explain how the system actually worked? Not to challenge Daniel, not to compete with him, just to make something visible that had always existed quietly in the background. I looked at my notebook for a moment. Then I closed it. The choice was simple. If the firm was about to build its future strategy on this framework, then the people designing that strategy deserved to understand the foundation beneath it. And I was the only person in the room who could show them. The decision itself didn't require a dramatic moment. There was no speech, no announcement, just a quiet adjustment in how I spent the next hour. Daniel was still refining his framework when I opened the internal documentation system again. Not to interfere with his work, nothing about what I was doing involved changing his model. Instead, I prepared something simpler. Clarity. Over the years, the operational data system had grown into a complex structure. Multiple reporting pipelines, verification layers, archived performance models, and the central maintenance logs that ensured every dataset remained consistent. Most people only saw the final spreadsheets. Almost no one saw the infrastructure behind them. So I assembled a short internal summary. Not a report, not a proposal, just a clear explanation of how the company's data architecture actually functioned, where the numbers came from, how they were verified, and why central maintenance mattered if any predictive framework was going to rely on them. It took less than 30 minutes. By the time I finished, the document contained 3 simple sections: the origin of the datasets, the maintenance process, and the dependencies any analytical framework would rely on. I attached several archive references for context. Then I sent it to the operations director, not to challenge Daniel's work, just to ensure leadership had the full picture while reviewing the model. No one on the consulting team noticed. Daniel continued adjusting formulas beside me, occasionally testing another scenario inside his framework. The office around us remained quiet. But somewhere upstairs, inside one of those conference rooms where senior partners were already discussing his idea, a new piece of information had just entered the conversation. And like most things that truly matter in organizations, it moved silently. Nothing visible changed at first. Daniel finished another version of his framework just before 5 and leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly. "Finally," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I nodded without looking away from my screen. Outside the windows, the light over the bay had already begun to fade into that soft gray Seattle evening. For a few minutes, the office felt perfectly normal. Then Daniel's inbox notification appeared. I noticed it only because he paused. He opened the message, read it once, then again more carefully. His expression didn't show concern. If anything, it looked thoughtful. "Looks like they want to review the framework with operations," he said after a moment. "Operations?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. "Apparently they want a full breakdown of the data structure before moving forward." He didn't sound frustrated, just slightly surprised, which made sense. Most consultants are used to discussing strategy directly with leadership. Operational infrastructure rarely enters those conversations right away. Daniel closed the email and glanced toward the hallway. "Interesting," he said. I simply nodded. Across the floor, I noticed something else. 2 senior managers were walking past the conference room again, speaking quietly with the operations director. The same director who had received my documentation summary less than an hour earlier. No one looked rushed. No one looked worried. But the direction of the conversation had shifted. The discussion was no longer just about the model. Now it was also about the system supporting it. And in organizations, when attention moves toward the system itself, priorities begin to change. Daniel turned back to his laptop and began preparing the materials they had requested. He didn't look concerned. In fact, he seemed energized by the opportunity to explain his work, which told me something important. He still believed the story was about the framework. But quietly, behind the scenes, a different realization was starting to form among leadership. If the company wanted to build something strategic on top of that model, they first had to understand the foundation beneath it. And suddenly, that foundation had become part of the conversation. By early evening, most of the office had emptied out. The quiet on the floor felt heavier than usual. Not tense, just unusually focused. Lights remained on in 2 of the conference rooms down the hallway, where the senior managers had continued their discussions longer than anyone expected on a Friday. Daniel was still at his desk. He had prepared several slides explaining how his framework worked. Clean diagrams, simplified projections, the kind of presentation consultants are trained to build quickly. From a technical perspective, it was solid. but something had already changed. Around 6:10 p.m., the operations director walked out of the conference room and approached our area. He stopped beside Daniel's desk. "Daniel," he said politely, "the partners appreciated your model." Daniel nodded, clearly pleased. "Thank you." The director continued. "They've been reviewing the data architecture behind it." "Sus? Ein?" Daniel glanced briefly toward me, then back at the director. "That makes sense," he said. "The model depends heavily on the historical datasets." "Yes," the director replied calmly. "Exactly." There was a small pause before he added something else. "And that infrastructure has been maintained almost entirely through Florence's systems." Daniel's eyes shifted toward me again, this time a little more carefully. Not defensive, just recalibrating. The director continued speaking, his tone still professional and even. "Before we move forward with the framework, leadership wants to ensure the operational layer is formally integrated into the strategy team." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." But something about his posture had changed slightly. Not panic, not frustration, just the quiet realization that the conversation had expanded beyond what he originally expected. The framework was still valuable, but now leadership was looking at the entire structure around it. Data systems, reporting pipelines, operational control. And once that conversation begins inside an organization, the structure of responsibility starts shifting. The director gave a brief nod. "We'll discuss the next steps on Monday morning." Then he turned and walked back toward the conference room. Daniel sat silently for a moment. Then he exhaled softly and closed the presentation on his screen. "Didn't expect that," he said. I looked back at my calendar, finishing the last note for the day. "Systems matter," I said calmly. He gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Apparently, they do." What Daniel didn't yet realize was that once leadership begins rethinking the foundation of a system, the structure built on top of it rarely stays the same. And by that point, there's no simple way to return things to how they were before. Monday morning arrived quietly. The office always felt slightly slower at the start of the week. People returning from the weekend, conversations about travel, coffee cups lingering a little longer before the first meetings began. Daniel arrived around the same time as usual. He greeted me politely, just like he had every day since his first Monday. "Morning, Florence." "Good morning." But there was a small difference in his tone now. Not tension, just awareness. Around 9:30, the consulting team received a meeting request from leadership. Subject: Strategy Integration Review. Daniel glanced at the invitation on his screen and gave a small exhale. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose we'll see where this goes." The meeting itself wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no accusations. Just a conference room with several senior partners, the operations director, Daniel, and me. Daniel presented his framework first. Clear slides, logical structure, a well-built model that showed real potential. The partners listened carefully. One of them nodded. "This is strong work," he said. "Very strong, especially for your first week." Daniel thanked him. Then the operations director spoke. "And as we discussed on Friday, the framework relies heavily on the company's centralized data infrastructure." He turned slightly toward me. "Florence has been maintaining that system for years." One of the partners leaned forward. "Florence, could you walk us through how the reporting structure actually works?" I did. Calmly. No technical grandstanding, no attempt to diminish Daniel's work. I simply explained how the datasets were maintained, how consistency was preserved, and why any strategic model built on top of them required coordination with operations. The room stayed quiet while I spoke. Not uncomfortable, just attentive. When I finished, Daniel looked thoughtful rather than defensive. "I didn't realize the system was that extensive," he said honestly. That's understandable, I replied. Most people only see the final reports. There was a short pause. Then one of the partners smiled slightly. That's exactly why this conversation matters. No confrontation, no competition, just a moment where the structure of the company became a little clearer to everyone in the room. After that meeting, nothing in the office looked dramatically different. The same desks, the same glass conference rooms, the same quiet hum of laptops and phone calls fills the floor. But the way people moved around me had changed, not in an exaggerated way. No sudden attention, no awkward apologies, just a subtle shift in how conversations happened. When discussions about data or reporting structures came up, people no longer spoke about them as if they appeared automatically. They asked questions, sometimes directly to me, sometimes by including me in meetings where those topics were being discussed. Daniel, interestingly, adapted the fastest. A few days later, he walked over to my desk with his laptop. "I've been adjusting the framework," he said. "Would you mind taking a look at the assumptions behind the data pipeline?" There was no defensiveness in his voice, just professionalism. I reviewed the model and pointed out a few places where the underlying datasets might evolve over time. He listened carefully, making notes as we talked. "Good to know," he said when we finished. "That actually makes the framework stronger." And he was right. What leadership eventually decided was simple. Daniel's model had real strategic value, but instead of treating it as a standalone consulting tool, they integrated it into a broader internal system, one that included the operational data infrastructure I had been maintaining all along. No dramatic promotions, no sudden titles, just a quiet restructuring of how strategy and operations worked together. For me, the change felt even simpler than that. For years, I had been the person maintaining the system behind the scenes. Now I was the person people came to when they wanted to understand it. The work itself hadn't changed. Only the visibility of it had. And strangely enough, that was more than enough. Looking back now, the entire story still feels quieter than people expect. No arguments, no rivalries, no dramatic moment where someone won. Just a series of small realizations that slowly changed how people saw the same system. Daniel's idea was good. There's no reason to pretend otherwise. His framework helped leadership recognize possibilities the company hadn't fully explored before. But the moment that truly changed things wasn't the model itself. It was the moment everyone realized that the model rested on something they had never really examined: the foundation. For years, I had maintained that foundation quietly. Files, reporting structures, historical datasets, documentation systems. Work that rarely appeared in presentations, but that made every presentation possible. And like many people who work in those invisible roles, I had grown used to something. Being underestimated. Not maliciously, just casually. Most organizations are full of people whose contributions stay hidden behind the visible results others present. Systems run smoothly, reports appear on time, data remains reliable. And because everything works, no one stops to ask how it stays that way. Until one day, they have to. What I learned from that week wasn't about recognition or status. It was something simpler. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes the quietest people in a room are the ones who understand the system best. They see the connections others overlook. They understand the structure beneath the surface. And when the moment comes to explain it, they don't need to raise their voices. They just need to speak clearly. Daniel and I still work together today, by the way. His models continue evolving. And every once in a while, he still leans over my desk and asks, "Florence, does the system support this idea?" I usually smile before answering, because the truth is, systems are built by many hands. Some visible, some quiet. And sometimes the most powerful position in any organization isn't the person standing in front of the presentation. It's the person who understands how the entire structure holds together. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated your role, only to realize later that you were the one holding everything together? I'd genuinely love to hear your story in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.